What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hello from New York. How are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by Kraken. And today I've got an interview with Adam Back and Bryan Bishop where we discuss the reality of block reorgs. But before that, I've got a message from my show sponsors. So firstly, let's talk about Kraken. They are the only exchange I use now for buying and selling Bitcoin. I think with everything they're doing around security and the future product releases, they're definitely the best exchange in the world. I love working with the team. I love everything that Jesse's done for the space, and I really support them. I've been using them for 2 months now. I've been doing my buys and sells and balancing the WBD books on Kraken. And yeah, the experience has been great. It's been really great to work with them. Whether you are new to Bitcoin or you're an experienced trader, they have the tools to help you, including margin and futures trading. And their volume-based, investor-friendly fee structure rewards you for trading so you can make more trades for less. I love them. Based on their ethics and their support of the industry, they are the only exchange that I will be using for Bitcoin. And if you want to support Kraken, if you want to start using them, head over to kraken.com, which is Kraken.com. And let's also talk about BlockFi. As I'm over here in New York, I caught up with the team last week, found out more about some of the exciting products that are going to be coming over the next year, which is super cool. And they've also renewed their sponsorship with the podcast. So they've been supporting me now since about August last year. I think it's about the third time we've renewed. So we're building this really strong relationship. Not one where I just do the ad reads, but one where I find out about their products and I can share it back with you. And also, I try them out myself to get experience of it. I haven't used their crypto-backed loans, but I am using their crypto interest accounts. I put 20% of my Bitcoin in there to earn interest, something I'm happy with. If you're thinking about doing it yourself, though, I do recommend you do your own research. It isn't a product that's for everyone. But if you are interested in finding out more about BlockFi, then head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. That is blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. Okay, so on to my interview with Adam and Bryan. And following all the discussions on Twitter recently about block reorgs, following the Binance hack, I thought it'd be great to get two of the most experienced Bitcoiners in a room to discuss this. There was a lot I didn't understand. I didn't understand the practicalities of it. And while block reorgs were something I'd heard about in the past, I didn't fully understand what the reality of them are, how they work technically, how they can be implemented in practice. And having spent time with Adam and Bryan, they did a really great job of explaining it to me and why they don't make any sense at all. I expect it's a conversation that will come up again and again in the future, but it's a really useful experience for me to talk to them about this. So as ever, if you've got any questions about the interview, you can reach out to me. And if you enjoy the podcast, if you want to support me, you want to help me with what I'm doing, then head over to my website at whatbitcoindid.com. There's a support page there that will explain everything you can do. And also, I want to say a massive thank you to my Patreon top tier sponsor, Rise Wallet, a new way into Bitcoin. There are no signups. You just scan a card and you are holding Bitcoin. Find out more by heading over to risewallet.com. Okay, so on to the interview. I hope you enjoy it. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Adam, how are you?
Good.
How you doing, Bryan?
Doing good.
So we're here to talk about reorgs, something I'd heard about before, because didn't the BSV chain have a couple of reorgs recently?
I actually don't follow Satoshi's vision that well.
Wow.
I think that was accidental, like a side effect of having extremely large blocks, kind of analogous to having a very fast block interval. You have a very fast block interval, you get reorgs. Some of the altcoins did this. So if you have an extremely large block, it has the same effects, which is the transfer time for the block becomes more than 10 minutes, and then you get random reorgs. So they had an effect like that, basically. But it wasn't a policy thing. It was just like a technical issue.
Well, it's a new thing for me to learn about in the last week or so. Lit up Twitter for a day. So probably the starting point is to just explain what a block reorg is. And also, has there ever been one on Bitcoin?
Oh, of course, there's been many Bitcoin reorgs. In fact, it's part of the design of Bitcoin that allows for reorgs to occur in the first place. A reorg is quite simply a situation where a new best chain tip has been discovered and clients and nodes on the network switch to that chain, which might have different transactions. Although it's not necessarily true that a reorg will not include transactions or will always have the same transactions. It's up to the miners that make those blocks to choose which transactions go into the blocks that appear in a reorg.
Why do reorgs exist though? You said there's been a few in the past. What's the reason?
The reason why reorgs are a thing in a system like Bitcoin, which is a decentralized consensus system, is because there's actually no formal authority to say what the correct chain really is. These alternative histories get proposed all the time in Bitcoin, and many are checked, and then most of them are invalid, and that's why the proof of work doesn't allow, the rules do not allow it to be accepted.
Yeah, I mean, it's a side effect of Bitcoin being a Poisson process. So you're sort of tossing coins and trying to find a solution. And the other side effect that causes it is it's a decentralized system. So there is no logical clock. There's no central correct time. And so if two miners, blocks, people are trying to find the parameters of the system are tuned such that blocks are found on average every 10 minutes, but occasionally they'll happen within a few seconds of each other. And it can happen that they're found close enough together that different parts of the network see different blocks first. And then it's just an accident. You have different views about what the current time is. And so there has to be a tiebreaker. And the tiebreaker is, well, you build on whatever you think came first, and we'll see who wins. And that's how Bitcoin works. So it's kind of a bit random at the edges. And so you get small reorganizations as part of that. And as Bryan was saying, typically, if they're running normal software, they're just going to, put the same transactions back into it. But occasionally, somebody will pay a higher fee in the meantime, and that would actually displace the original transaction that was like one confirm and replace it with a different higher fee paying one that becomes one and then two confirm.
In fact, it gets really interesting because in certain situations, people have broadcasted different versions of quote unquote the same Bitcoin transaction, but realistically, in the event of a reorg, a miner can actually choose to include any version of any of the valid transactions they've seen in the past.
Does that mean transactions can get lost?
Transactions could get lost in a reorg, although it's somewhat unlikely. The way that the software is written is that reorgs, by default in Bitcoin Core, if you are mining, you're including something from your mempool. And only if you have custom software is it a situation where you're likely to exclude a large majority of the data that people have already seen. That's the default.
So do transactions then go back into the mempool?
Generally speaking, there is a mempool and things are taken from the mempool when they're inserted into a block. And if a block gets reorganized because there was a race where two are found at the same time, logically they get extracted back from the block that's now undone and put back into the mempool, and you see them come in a new block. But I think you get that by side effect, but the overlap, like the transactions that are not in the new block that were in the old block, get reinserted into the mempool.
So reorgs are a design aspect of the Bitcoin system. And it's actually really important that merchants and other companies using Bitcoin implement reorg handling. The ability to handle these reorgs and account for this during the course of their normal business activity. If they don't do this, even normal reorgs can actually cause problems for some businesses where they don't expect a 1 or 2 block reorg, which are actually far more frequent, exponentially more frequent than any other block reorg. Like a 100 block reorg is virtually unheard of compared to a 1 or 2 block reorg.
So these are happening quite regularly then? So it's a natural part of Bitcoin?
Actually, over time, the amount of reorgs that have occurred has been going down, I believe. There's actually not too many public sources that are tracking this data anymore, probably because people stopped being interested in these numbers because they were dropping off a cliff. However, you do have to be prepared for them to occur.
Okay. But this is a very different scenario from what was proposed for Binance, because this seems to be what you're explaining to me is a natural part of Bitcoin in that it's really to do with like propagation time. It just, things happen. But with what was recommended with Binance and what was his name? Jeremy Rubin. This was actually suggested as a tool to reverse the hack. So what's different here?
Yeah, it's not a new discussion in the sense that there have been many exchange hacks before. And in each of those, this kind of conversation came up. And actually, because Bitcoin's market cap was smaller and more coins were stolen, this is actually about 100 times less money on the scale of Bitcoin than like Mt. Gox, and about 10 times less than the Bitfinex in August 2016. And Mt. Gox was, I think, February 2014. So this is kind of a long, people resolved that there's nothing useful to do here. And you just have to accept that Bitcoin is final because a bunch of factors which we can get into, but It's basically, all of the infrastructure is set up to automatically just continue consuming and finalizing transactions. And there's a lot of inertia and equipment that's just, running away, mining transactions. So it's very hard. The software is not designed to undo things. None of the infrastructure is designed to undo it. There's all kinds of side effects that would occur if you did. And the side effects are both technical and economic. In game theory, if you can undo something, well, the attacker can do other things, and people who disagree with the reorg can do other things. People are very incentivized to see it not happen because they've seen other coins have this happen and suffer great loss of credibility as a result. And there are also geopolitical issues that, you would establish a precedent that would erode one of the major benefits of Bitcoin, being censorship resistance, which ties back to this kind of finality at the network level.
So there are other incentive issues, like Adam was mentioning, such as situations where in the event that you are doing a reorg to try to take back a heist, the thief can choose to make transactions that spend their coins to predominantly pay miners to choose to continue to take the blockchain with the heist that occurred. And then there's all sorts of other things that can be done on both sides. So it gets to be very complicated very quickly.
But this was debated many hours after the hack. So a number of blocks will have already been,
Indeed. So in a previous company that I worked at, I guess I should step back for a second and say, I actually believe that companies probably have a legal obligation to seriously consider how they do reorg handling, both on the receiving end and then also making reorgs in the event of a heist. I'm not saying it's a good idea for them to do this, but I do believe they probably have the legal obligation to investigate this. So actually, at a previous company that I worked at, I did very thoroughly investigate this and put together a plan and implementation details for how to go about doing this. And it looked pretty interesting, and it required a lot of upfront work. If you are going to actually do this successfully within the few blocks that occur after a heist, you have to be prepared. So that includes monitoring the blockchain, having a very close eye on what's going on, and then also having infrastructure in place already that you can quickly deploy to miners who already understand the situation and already know what this technology is. If you do not have this prepared and ready, then none of this is happening in a timely manner, and it just won't happen.
And I guess the longer away from the heist it is, the harder it is?
Oh, absolutely. The more expensive and the harder it is. Absolutely.
So theoretically, it would almost have been impossible for Binance to do this.
Yes, it would be impossible for Binance to do this after the fact.
But I guess people have discussed it because if it ever happens in future, then perhaps if there's some kind of process in place that the community could react. But we're not keen on it.
I don't actually believe it would be a community reaction. I certainly believe it should be, but any company can unilaterally decide to try to implement this software and try to convince miners to implement it. Hopefully the miners would choose not to because they'll recognize the extreme risk this brings to the Bitcoin ecosystem.
Because you could essentially then use this on any transactions?
Well, first of all, this is coordinated mining. This is like a 51% attack. That's what we're talking about here. This is like a coordinated activity that is actively against Bitcoin's best interests. Mm-hmm. It's something for a short-term gain to prevent a heist or undo a heist, rather. It's a reactive security model. And it is in spite of the long-term situation that would cause.
The other problem is, as I was saying, we don't think it's really practical to do this with or without planning, in my opinion. Just an acceptability to the ecosystem. So I'd say on a technical basis, it's essentially impossible to do it reactively. And on a social basis, it's implausible to do it with a planned approach because the community doesn't agree with undoing things, basically. And this is not just philosophical or pedantic. It's very practical. So the current financial world lives with imperfect finality, and they have review boards that daily meet and decide how to socialize the losses and who takes a loss when they make a mistake, because you have the ability to do naked selling, and sometimes they sell things they don't have by accident or fail to buy them in time. And so, in the Bitcoin case, it's a decentralized system where you don't know who you're transacting with. If things can randomly fail for policy reasons, people will game it on both sides of the equation, and you'll be left with essentially like a daily accounting mess to try and resolve with no identities. So I think it's really not compatible with Bitcoin's basic mechanism for operating. So, I mean, there are the practical things, like as Peter Willa and Greg Maxwell commented on Stack Exchange, they wrote a kind of summary of the scorched earth thing that Bryan was talking about, and I guess you can post a link in the talk notes, where the attacker can also use the free money that he's stolen to outbid you, to pay miners to not recover the theft, but to keep the theft. So it kind of, that's why the scorched earth names comes from. Like, nothing is left, it all gets paid to miners. But you have to consider that, so what Greg and Peter were saying is that because of the coordination problem, you need over 50% or it's not happening, and you're not going to get 100% because it's very hard to reach people and there's lots of unattended equipment. And, so let's say they started with 66, like 2/3 of the hash rate, it's going to be running at half speed. And by the time do this high risk, unplanned thing with patched code, which is not really practical, it's going to take 24 hours to undo it because you're running at half speed and 12 hours has already elapsed. And during these 24 hours, everybody knows that any transaction you make, you can undo it very easily. You just pay yourself, like you make a transaction, swap your coins on exchange for other coins on another network or other assets that won't get undone. And then you wait a couple of hours, and then you send another transaction that pays higher fees to pay yourself, take the money back, and you get away with it in the mix. So practically speaking, that means the entire exchange ecosystem is going to be down for 24 hours because people are going to notice this and they're going to suspend withdrawals, deposits, trading. And the loss of business implied by that is, a factor of 10 or 100 of the loss. So it's economically implausible from that perspective. And these are just immediate things people will do. And the other thing is, you could say, well, what about blacklists? Like Binance or whoever the attack is about would advise exchanges, don't transact these transactions. But the problem is that most of the ecosystem disagrees with undoing. So they may either just say, no, I refuse, or they may pretend to do it. Like say, oh, we had a technical accident and we're sorry, but we swapped coins with the attacker and now we're the victim. Don't undo it because we're gonna lose money. So, given that there's so many people that really think that finality is important to Bitcoin, there's likely to be kind of willful pretend victims and pretend, and then the other, so if that happens, then you have to abort the undo because you don't want to take money from the wrong people. Or if you do take money from the wrong people, somebody has to make them whole. And if you don't know who to make whole and you don't know who's lying and who's telling the truth, you got a forensic accounting mess. And we saw how long Mt. Gox takes to unwind once you get forensic accountants in there. So it's just not worth it. And it doesn't, it's not resolvable technically. And it's only resolvable in a very slow and expensive and error-prone way with forensic accounting that takes years. So I don't think it really works because Bitcoin is trying to do something very clean, elegant, and fairly immediate final settlement.
So going back to the Stack Overflow link where Peter Willa wrote a very interesting reply, I would like to read just a short excerpt here where he says, pretty interesting idea. He says, in the extreme scenario where miners are coordinating a rollback and it's actually happening, the public and the community has time to react. If a sufficiently large group of economically relevant parties in the network refuse to accept the rollback, despite the large amount of hash rate behind it, miners would have no choice but to go along with this. This is a last resort option, sort of like a user-activated soft fork.
Yeah. How do they reject it, though?
Well, a user-activated soft fork in this scenario or any sort of user-activated response would have to involve a source code change, and the users would have to choose to run that software.
On their nodes?
Yeah, actually, Luke gave an example using a shell script to call invalidate block in a loop so that if a full node tries to go backwards and build on a previous transaction set or something like that. Anyway, basically involves calling invalidate block for any blocks you don't like. And blocks you don't like are blocks that try to redo the transactions that were cancelled. So basically they could call invalidate block, which is an existing RPC handle, but more cleanly you would want to patch because people don't want to run shell scripts and things like that.
Just run through the scenario that somebody chose to implement a block reorg. What actually practically happens? Do they go to the block previous to the hack? Or is it they're doing something new in the current blocks? I mean, you've got to remember, I don't know this stuff, yeah.
So to be clear, a constructed reorg would be something that starts from the block before the heist occurred. And then also it would have to include either enough sufficient blocks with enough proof of work attached to them for it to be considered better than whatever the current main chain is considered by other nodes on the Bitcoin network.
And how would you actually coordinating having miner support for this?
Yes, so that's an interesting question. How do you actually coordinate a 51% attack? Well, let me clearly outline it for all of our listeners here. Here's exactly how you attack the Bitcoin network. What you do is you get a very giant mining pool and you centralize everything and you tell all the miners to connect to this mining pool and then you construct whatever blocks you want and then Bitcoin dies. So there it is. There's the secret.
A block reorg is just a 51% attack?
Yes. However, it's important to note that reorgs are when people talk about reorgs, they're usually talking about non-adversarial reorgs that are just a natural consequence of the Bitcoin rules.
But if you could coordinate 51% for a block reorg...
By the way, I think it's important to note that actually when we say 51%, we actually don't mean 51% because there's actually situations where significantly less, like 26 to 31% can actually do the job quite well.
Because...
Oh, well, because of something subtle to do with the optimal game you can play. Somebody noticed the Selfish Mining paper. They noticed that if you withhold blocks, you gain a strategic informational advantage. And because of that, and assuming that the other party doesn't adopt a counteracting strategy, which they would. So anyway, it opens up a new branch in the game tree for behavior of mining, the selfish mining, which surprisingly to many people, well, to everybody, I think, basically, or almost everybody, I think there might have been one kind of oblique post on Bitcoin Talk a few years before that seemed to have some ideas in the same direction, but generally speaking, it was a surprise that you can get an advantage. But, you know, if you've got multiple groups of miners that are colluding together, you can get 2 groups or 3 groups that are all trying to selfish mine, and then it would start to cancel out. So it's a bit of a dynamic situation. But generally speaking, I think Brian's point is that, you know, 51%, if you had 51% fighting 49%, you're going to be there for months until you've outbid the last 12 hours of work, right? Because it's going to be progressing at a rate of like 1%, and it's going to take ages for and it's going to look like very low hash rate, right? So it's going to, what would have been a 2016 block, a 2-week difficulty adjustment interval would potentially stretch into, you know, months of. So it'd be very. Sorry, you wouldn't try that because it would just be a mess.
In the far future, there's also other reorg issues like this that occur in a situation where the Bitcoin subsidy has reached nearly zero. Because if you make a Bitcoin transaction that has a high amount of fee attached to it, then miners actually have an incentive to do reorgs to try to undo that block and take the fee for themselves. And so some thinking needs to be done around that.
Next up, I talked to Adam and Bryan more about block reorgs, but before that, I got a message from my show sponsors. So I'm going to talk to you about Dropbit first. They're my newest sponsor, and I've got to say a massive thank you to them for sponsoring my party in New York last night. It was a great night. For those who came, I hope you really enjoyed it. It'd be great to hear from you. I think there's some photos floating around. But yes, massive thanks to Dropbit for enabling this to happen. And yeah, I've been using the wallet quite regularly now. I must have done at least 20 payments with it now. I love it. It's a really easy wallet to use. The UX is amazing. It's kind of like a Venmo for Bitcoin. It's just a great way to be able to send in Bitcoin to and from each other. So yeah, I love it. If you're at Consensus and you see me, come and give me a tap on the shoulder. My wallet is loaded up. I'll be happy to send out some Bitcoin to people. Just come and tap me on the shoulder and I'll send you some Bitcoin. If you want to check it out yourself, it's available for iPhone and Android. Just head over to dropbit.app, which is dropbit.app. And also, let's talk about BlockFi. And as I mentioned, I popped in to see the team this week. We have this really great relationship where they're always telling me about the products that come in, and I feed back to them. I tell them what I think of it, but I also tell them what you think of it. We have this great relationship. I can also get on the phone to them anytime and discuss things. So it's super cool. And I'm really excited about some of the things they're working on. I can't tell you about them yet, but they've got at least 3 announcements coming up in the coming months with new ideas, which are going to be super cool. Can't wait to talk to you about that. But if you are interested in checking them out, they do have their crypto-backed loans altcoins and their crypto interest accounts. I am testing out the crypto interest accounts. I'm happy with it. I'm happy with the interest I'm getting. It's super cool at the end of the month to get my statement. If you do think of checking it out, you should definitely do your own research. And I've also got an interview with Zach Prince on my SoundCloud where he answers questions about it. But if you do want to find out more, head over to blockfi.com, which is BLOCKFI.com. And lastly, I want to tell you about my new sponsor. It's one for you hardcore traders out there. It's Reorgs, the world's best crypto trading terminal, and it's available now on a Mac and PC. So I'm not an advanced trader, right? I don't do a lot of trading now, but I've downloaded the software, I've installed it, I've had a play with it. I've been able to get out my charts for Kraken to see what's happening with Bitcoin, which has been pretty cool this last few days, right? Pretty happy with the prices. But it comes with a whole bunch of features for you hardcore traders out there. Using your API keys, you're going to be able to trade on up to 9 exchanges, including Kraken. They have a deep focus on security, and your API keys are encrypted locally and stored in memory. You can fully customize your workspace to exactly your trading requirements, and all connections to the exchanges are fast and secure. So definitely go and check it out. They've got a 14-day free trial, and it's available at getaurox.com, which is GETAUROX.com. That is getaurox.com, which is GETAUROX.com.
So it just seems to me like there's nothing in these block reorgs. There's nothing here to be done. There's nothing here to be talked about. Like, okay, let's have the debate. Let's get it out there. And now it's done. There's no practical solution.
That's correct. But there is important takeaways that users should hear from this, like especially for merchants and people running Bitcoin businesses. I absolutely must stress that it is so important to have a high confirmation threshold for transactions that you accept, and to please test your infrastructure against reorgs. You can use Bitcoin Core Reg Test. There's reorgs are very easy and very cheap and trivial to make in Reg Test mode, and every company should be testing that.
How many confirmations is enough then? Because most people tend to operate with 6, but you're giving me an idea.
So actually, the answer to how many confirmations are enough is actually pretty interesting. It depends on the business. If you are working with miners and you have a somewhat adversarial business where like miners are like maybe hedging some of their Bitcoin against their mining expenses, then your actual confirmation threshold should probably be at least 100. In fact, I think that's the same for Adam's Liquid network, is about 100 confirmations. In other situations, though, I actually recommend scaling the confirmation threshold requirement based off of the quantity of Bitcoin in the transaction. And then in other situations, it's based off of monitoring the weather or the other events going on in the Bitcoin network. If this is a particularly tumultuous time where reorgs are occurring, perhaps you should increase that number so that it is higher than the average reorg size lately, or reorg depth lately. And then finally, I've seen a number of companies or even individuals try to get away with 0 confirmation transactions. And the only way to do that safely is through the Lightning Network at the moment. You should not be accepting 0 conf transactions.
Actually, Bitrefill accept that. I think they've calculated the risk.
Yes, you can calculate the risk all you want, but there's still going to be damage to the community if your business either fails or has some sort of consequence downstream for other people accepting transactions from Bitrefill or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. Doing like derivatives or exchange trading is quite different because there's large amounts of money at stake, and you're giving people the opportunity to extract value immediately in large quantity. Where it's a little, and there, you've provided them with the foothold to execute an economic attack if they're so inclined, right? But I think Bitrefill is more like selling online goods and physical goods as well. And if you are selling like copies of a PDF report, your cost of production is effectively 0. So even if you had a 10% fraud rate, you might not really care that much, right? If that made it more convenient to buy and you made more than 10% more sales because of it, you might tolerate that. And you might see the same kind of calculus in a coffee shop that you're like, well, people don't want to steal from you to your face because you realize like, oh, that guy just like walked out without paying for his coffee. That was sneaky. We'll recognize him next time, right? Or there's a social stigma attached to it. So for low cost of production things, that can make economic sense for a merchant. So there was a kind of previous era argument about RBF where some people wanted to like completely deprecate unconfirmed transactions, and others wanted to say, well, we can tolerate a certain amount of fraud in our particular use case because the cost of goods is 0. It's like electronic.
So briefly, talking about exchanges, there's actually a consideration for reorg attacks and exchanges. The attack goes like this. Someone deposits a large amount of Bitcoin to an exchange, trades around, and withdraws in another currency. And then there's a reorg attack, and the deposit that exchange was expecting no longer exists in the blockchain. And this is how you can steal money from exchanges. Now, there's some mitigations. One that I devised, and I'm sure other people thought of it as well, is that exchanges that process withdrawal requests should taint their withdrawal Bitcoin transactions with references to the deposits that they recently received. This way, if the deposits go away, then the withdrawal transactions are no longer valid.
Nice. I like it. There are lots of interesting technical tricks that, so I mean, you asked the question, is it reasonable to, elaborate and dig into this? And I think, there's no discouragement for technical discussion ever. Like, there's no unreasonable question. It's like aircraft crash investigation. Any reasonable question, any question should be answered, right? There's no unreasonable question. And people who go through aircraft crash or aircraft systems line of business are indoctrinated and taught that you must question everything. You mustn't be, practice differentiality to senior people. Like, the intern at the company should feel free to point out an obvious flaw that the CEO is making and not be cowed by the tone of his answer or something, right? So, and it's important because people are going to die and planes are going to fall out of the sky if people don't ask questions. And Bitcoin has that kind of characteristic. So it's certainly useful to talk about it and to understand the game theory and to, understand the history of why different things were considered a bad idea. Because unfortunately with Bitcoin, it's a very technical sphere with a wide range of topics, and often the thinking behind design decisions is not explained. Well, Bitcoin didn't come with design consideration documents. People kind of reverse engineered it. And if you want to know like a shortcut to like, well, what was a design consideration for something? Typically, the only way to find out is to go on Bitcoin Wizards and ask people until they explain it to you. That's the fast path. The slow path is you read it for yourself and you think very hard and try and figure it out for yourself. And maybe you'll make another kind of variant or another realization. So it's kind of interesting, but it is useful to think about the trade-offs and for people to be aware of the technical possibilities so that they're, if you ever do network programming or design of network protocols, it doesn't just have to work. It has to work in any conceivable, however contrived network condition. And network conditions are not clean. Like, sometimes a network can be connected in one direction and not another, or intermittently. So a very strange sort of partition or partial partitions. So you have to design assuming all these things. And Bitcoin is designed in that way, encoded in that way. So it's important to explore all possibilities. So I think we talked about like technical things, like, technical countermeasures, economic countermeasures. And there's another topic that arises from this, which is sort of geopolitical risk. So if you were to, if a 51% attack or an undo for what to get executed with or without planning and not just fail for some reason, it would set a policy precedent. And that policy precedent would, to my mind, greatly weaken Bitcoin's credibility as a store of value and as a censorship-resistant electronic cash payment system. And that's because, many of the features of Bitcoin, like censorship resistance, unfreezability, unseizability, could be undone by a policy like this. And it's a slippery slope. So, this one, you can say, well, it was an exchange. They probably really were hacked. They're probably not, pretending they were hacked so they can keep the money or something. The next time maybe it is an exchange that it's far less clear whether they actually stole the money themselves or not, right? Or next time it's a Silk Road version and some people want to see that undone and some people don't. And there are lots of, geopolitical arguments, and it's just a slippery slope. It'll get easier and simpler each time until, people are wanting to undo it for like a parking validation or something like that, right? So that kind of makes a mockery about what electronic cash means. Electronic cash means cash-like. You hand over the payment and it's done. You can't like undo, oh, sorry, I want my money back because the good was, there's a cost, right? If you have a payment system where you can contest and undo payments, that's like credit cards, and the fees in credit cards are not just high because they're companies trying to make a profit or rent seek.
Chargebacks.
They're high because there are chargebacks. They're high because there's an insurance and investigation cost to validating whether a chargeback is okay or not, and it gets passed on to consumers. So if you get undos in Bitcoin, it loses all these interesting properties that are baked into the way people use it in exchanges. So it will basically come back to the 24-hour daily global review board looking at which transactions we believe should be undone or not by these review board people. And that's not Bitcoin. That's the status quo.
That's EOS.
Well, I mean, it's even before that. It's how traditional exchanges and clearinghouses work.
Yeah.
They have technical failures. And there are blockchains that operate literally in this way. They have, like you mentioned, EOS, I think, is one that has a set of humans that make policy decisions and block transactions and things like that. And that's considered by most people to be inadvisable on a legal basis, and also not very interesting, right? Because it's subject to human judgment and policy, and that can be gamed in any direction. So I think that is also a part of why people are not keen to see reorgs. And you could probably construct some even more interesting arguments. And also the other thing to bear in mind is this is just, us talking off the top of our head. The game tree of interesting and counterintuitive and unthought of counterattacks somebody could and likely would do if some of these things were to be considered is much wider than we've covered here, right? So in particular, if the users are extremely against this line of, this pivot of Bitcoin away from cash finality and into some kind of different network that has policy level undos with some authority, users are not going to agree with this. And there are going to be a number of things they could do in terms of preventing it. They could, make protocol extensions or loose semi-automated mechanisms to prevent it. And I think a couple of people have suggested that the mining equipment itself could reject reorgs. So it turns out that Luke Dasher had something like this in the BFG Miner software. So BFG Miner is the original firmware for ASICs when they first came out. There's an ARM control board and it's running some software, and Luke wrote the first version of that software, which is a driver for the hardware, but also enough software to connect to a mining pool and drive the software. And so typically you configure two pools, and what he wrote is that, and that's in case one of them fails, you don't want to be dead and not receiving any funds while you're waiting for the pool to reboot. So you'll auto switch to the next pool if one stops responding. But he also added an interesting feature where if the pool asked you to mine backwards, like at a lower height or something like that, something with that side effect, it would automatically switch to the other pool. So in the scenario that Bryan described, where people try to get a popular pool or a group of pools and change the policy, well, any miner using BFG Miner would automatically switch to its backup pool and avoid that outcome. So now if you philosophically think this is a good thing, you would install that software, or other people would add features like that deeper and deeper into the miner firmware or even into the ASIC to sort of make hardware that is a ratchet. Like the hardware itself doesn't know how to and has no way to go backwards. And, we were talking earlier about very far future, some decades down the line, where Bitcoin's price and deployment and adoption is kind of, reached the top of its S-curve. Presumably price will stabilize, plus or minus. And then there's a question about securing the network from reward. The reward will be less because of more halvings. Price will be stable. And will that be enough to secure the network? So there are fees. But another thing you could do to keep the network flowing is to make equipment that can't undo things. Because then, if there is a policy question about we want to undo this or some element that wants to undo it, they have to replace the hardware.
Yeah, but you can't force people to use certain hardware, though.
Right, but I think the point is it comes in the similar line of defense as us observing that you could do something if you had time to plan ahead. And people have two modes of thinking. One is the panic when they want to undo a mistake. And the other one is the calm water, steady state, where people agree that Bitcoin should be final. We agree, we understand how that works. That's how we've architected our system. And so it's much harder to find a political will to like pivot Bitcoin's model to an undo model. And so, if people put in systems in different parts of the software stack, like at the protocol level, in the miner, in the pool protocol, in exchange operation, it's just, there's a lot of inertia in software. And to overcome inertia on a dime because you're panicked about something right now, it just makes it harder and harder. And particularly if it's like if people agree on when they're in the, let's make Bitcoin secure and final mode of thinking, the normal steady state, that, yeah, that feature should go in miners and a bunch of miners have it. Like, let's say that happens. Now, when you get to the panic mode of thinking, it's much more difficult to do it because you have to disassemble the equipment and change it, or maybe you can't, you have to replace the ASICs. And then there's a different cost, which is not just the electrical cost, but you have to replace $1 billion worth of ASICs or something. So that would be a useful function to my point of view, because it would mean that Bitcoin could be secure with less hash rate or less economic incentive. And it's also interesting in the sense of this dichotomy between people's thinking in their panic mode, where something bad's happening, something unfortunate's happened, and they feel remorse for the person that's been stolen from. They would really like to help them out, but the side effects have receded from their mind because of the immediacy of the problem. It's almost it has analogies with the Bitcoin Genesis block, which is about the chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. Now, that same chancellor, Mervyn King, had written really long essays in the Times of London in the months before that event, where he really kind of lectured his viewpoint that this is a moral hazard and really should not happen. And yet the same guy was basically forced by political expediency because of the panic of the situation to go back and do the opposite, right? So it's kind of panic mode thinking. And Bitcoin's Genesis block says, panic thinking is bad kind of thing, right? Look at fear and what happens when you do panic thinking. And here are people trying to introduce this kind of problem into Bitcoin, is my point of view.
Would the scenario have been different if, say, there was wider adoption of Matt Corallo's Better Hash? Would that change things?
I think it's interesting because it would complicate greatly the coordination problem. Because
that's what I was thinking.
Better Hash and at Blockstream we worked on something of similar design, which didn't get completed to fruition, called Open Hash, but it's a similar idea. It's basically the protocol is trying to give the decision about which transactions to put into a block to more decentralize that and put that into hands of individual power users and miners, where they can still use a less decentralized pool to reduce variance. And so if you've got more independence in choosing blocks, now if you want to assemble 51%, you have to coordinate with more people, and all these power users are far less likely to follow the expediency of the day.
So I recall vaguely, it was probably a Blockstream idea to have mining equipment that actually had some checks and balances built in. And I'm wondering, is that an extension of Better Hash, or was that even before Better Hash and Open Hash?
So that was Greg Maxwell's idea. And I don't know if it predated Blockstream or not, but anyway, it came out during a period where there were new mining manufacturers joining the market. And there's a similar kind of question about that a lot of the equipment is in other people's data centers these days, right? In the earlier days, people were GPU mining, or they had the ASICs in the garage, and it became so industrialized that realistically nobody had physical control. And so if you have your miners in a data center, the data center operator could just change the rules, right? He could packet filter the network and impose things from the network so you wouldn't know, or he could go change the configuration of all the machines, and they have tools to automatically change configuration on 1,000 machines with a click of a button. And so Greg's thinking there was, well, you could make a kind of smart contract. So this is what Bryan was saying, where you tell the ASIC or the farmer in the ASIC that, hey, I'm the owner of this equipment, and it's going to mine for me for the next month because I paid for it, and there's nothing the hoster can do to change the miner configuration. All they could do is switch it off. They can't change it. And so he came with some clever ideas of how to kind of put something in the miner, like NVRAM or flash memory, in a very embedded, hard to get at place that would refuse to be changed until it reached a certain block height, where if you were leasing the machine, it would expire after a while. If it was your machine, maybe it would never expire.
I guess there isn't a game theory, isn't there, for miners anyway, to implement these large block reorgs anyway, because if you can 51% attack the network, you kill the network, right?
So one theoretical source that perhaps is not too theoretical is the idea of a miner that is actually incentivized by things other than Bitcoin. And the idea, though, is that hopefully Bitcoin is valuable enough that miners are always going to be incentivized by Bitcoin.
I guess nation state attack is the only other incentive.
Well, I mean, there are other coins that use the same proof of work functions. I mean, some coins have different proof of work functions, and that's a trend lately. But there are some competing SHA-256 coins.
In fact, the existence of alternative blockchains that use the same proof of work function is actually a bad thing, because that actually splits up the hash rate onto multiple networks, and it lowers the cost of forging an alternate history. The fact that we have, I think Peter Willa calculated that we've done at least 2 to the 80 or even 2 to the 90 cycles through the Bitcoin network by now, which is actually a proof of principle that certain forms of like 80-bit or 90-bit security can actually be broken. And that is also a form of proof of principle for Bitcoin, that someone could amass a lot of mining hash rate and make that available. The fact that we're splitting it up between multiple blockchains is actually really bad. I was working briefly on a project with a number of other collaborators who prefer to remain anonymous, I think, on a project called forkgen.tech. And the idea was that it would automatically generate for a customer a new fork of Bitcoin. And the idea was that hopefully this would actually lower the value of all these forks of Bitcoin to zero. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. They just said, thank you for doing this for us. Thanks for doing all the hard work. And then they went and made a lot of forks of Bitcoin. But nonetheless, in some cases, this means that the hash rate is now split up. And there was, of course, a hash rate option to change the proof of work to like script or something. But nonetheless, people can do whatever they want.
So do you think there's some required changes now for mining? I mean, can you actually even change the algorithm? Or does that require new hardware for everyone? How does that work?
There are some ideas for changing the proof of work function for Bitcoin. In my opinion, the way that is most likely to go forward is a situation that I would call like a blended proof of work, where you have first the original SHA-256, double SHA-256 proof of work function, and then you also soft fork in another requirement for an additional proof of work. And then like over some time period, this like changes the proportions or something. And then like in the far future, perhaps you can stop the SHA-256 mining, but that's really far in the future.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that changing the proof of work would, I mean, to achieve ecosystem consensus for that, there would have to be a major defect with the current proof of work. And it doesn't have a defect at the moment, right? So, and it looks like it's good for years to come. So I think, you would need to see something like some of the very early hash functions, particularly like MD4, had some pretty bad cryptographic attacks, and they became weaker and weaker over time. So if you saw SHA-256 heading in that direction in like a few decades' time, then it might be time to like start phasing in a new hash function. And there are a couple of, I mean, like SHA-3 is a new hash function, so they exist. But, I think it's a difficult thing to see happen, because there's a lot of people with their own mining equipment. And so if there was a change, it would need to happen over the course of years so that that equipment was already obsolete before it would take effect. And there's also seems to be cases in other coins where people are attached to the proof of work. Like they consider 21 million coins to be a defining part of the protocol. And it's certainly seen the case where in other coins, people talked about changing a proof of work, and like there's been heavy resistance to it because they considered it to be kind of a defining part of the network and they didn't want it to be messed with. So it is a very dramatic thing. So, I mean, I don't think anybody's, even mentioning that in this context, generally speaking. It's just a kind of technical curiosity as to, in the very far future, how you could get algorithm agility, how you could phase it in, and could it be done in a way that doesn't disrupt the functioning of the network or something.
Okay, so basically block reorgs are bad for Bitcoin. They're antithetical to Bitcoin. They're impractical, unreliable, and should just be dropped and forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, I think the game theory doesn't really work out, because to react without foreplanning is too risky. It's kind of like your chances are that it's going to be worse, right? It's probably going to technically fail. You're going to be disruptive to the network for days or weeks, even while it's happening. So the economy, like the Bitcoin economy of exchanges and payment processors, is going to lose more money than the hack. And the last hack, I mean, there have been an ongoing series of hacks, is 100 times smaller than one of the earliest big infamous hacks, the Mt. Gox issue. And Bitcoin economy is much bigger, So it sounds like a lot of money, but there are individual exchanges that have made more than that in a week, for example. They don't want to lose, business. So it's certainly the case that for the whole network to switch off, it'd be much cheaper for the exchanges to have a whip around and like help somebody out than to undergo this kind of disruption, which doesn't say anything about the longer term side effects, right? The geopolitical issues, the fact that other parties would try to abuse the situation while it was going on, and just the negative news cycle that would be around it, and the kind of damage of Bitcoin as digital gold that's cash-like. It's not cash-like if somebody can undo it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's pretty good. Before we finish, I just want to ask you both about one, maybe two things following my chat with Luke. Something that came up that I wasn't fully aware of or didn't understand to the level that Luke explained. But Luke said he believes that for Bitcoin's security and future, that 85% of people using Bitcoin should be running a full node.
Well, actually, in my opinion, that number should actually be 100% of people should be running a full node.
But in the practical world.
Well, the philosophy behind this, though, is that if you're not running the Bitcoin rules, you're not actually running Bitcoin. Exactly. Someone else has your keys or someone else is checking the blocks for you, and you're not actually running the Bitcoin protocol. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin was not designed for that.
I know, but like in a practical sense, as Bitcoin grows and more people adopt it, most people will use a hardware wallet. Some will keep money on exchanges. And yes, someone's holding their private keys for them. But I think getting to 100% of people to have a full node will be very difficult.
So actually, regarding exchanges holding coins and having custody, I actually disagree. And I think that there will be centralized exchanges that have decentralized custody, where either it's multi-sig with the participants or multi-sig with escrow agents or other ways of doing it. I think there's definitely options on the horizon.
I think reaching 100% of people having a full node is unrealistic.
I mean, I tend to agree. And I think that you get most of the positive effects of everybody having a full node by having some reasonable percentage of people having a full node, particularly if that's weighted towards people with more economically at stake. And the analogy that has been drawn sometimes is it's like the paper cash counterfeit detectors in shops. So if a few shops have them, counterfeit notes get detected, not immediately, but after, you take it out, the first shop doesn't notice, but the second shop does. So they get taken out of circulation or they get noticed. And they get noticed because the person who accepted it rejects it. I gave you the note and you say it's a dud. Now I'm going to go back to the person who gave it to me and say, what the heck, man, you gave me a dud note and you pay me some real money now, right? So it doesn't take that higher percentage. It doesn't have to be 100%, but 30% would catch that kind of thing pretty quickly. And the people who have a lot at stake, like exchanges and payment processors, people selling high value items, people doing local Bitcoin transactions, traders, it doesn't cost them much to run a full node. And, at Blockstream, we have a product, well, it's kind of a alpha stage thing at the moment called AB Core. You can download and run it. It runs on Android devices, including like a high-end smartphone where you can actually run a full node on a smartphone. Okay, you want to use Wi-Fi some of the time because it uses kind of a lot of bandwidth. But, that tech is on the horizon. And at the conference yesterday, HTC, which is a handset manufacturer, talked about their plans to provide a full node on an HTC handset. So I don't know how they'll do that in terms of bandwidth, but maybe they can strike a deal with the network provider to exempt the Bitcoin traffic from your bandwidth allowance or something like that. But it's possible. I mean, of course, the transaction rates are, as people adopt Bitcoin, there's more demand for block space. The blocks get bigger. They're not at capacity yet. If people would adopt the tech, you can get a lot more transactions in a block with batching and with SegWit adoption and Schnorr and Taproot and things in the future.
So actually, that HTC announcement was definitely about running Bitcoin Core on a phone, but also another big aspect of that was that they're planning to either release or open source a lot of their software that they're using on there. And I think that's actually really interesting. HTC is a major cell phone manufacturer, and it's great seeing, I mean, this is like huge for adoption. So I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how that unfolds.
How much space on the phone would that be using?
Well, in this case, they would, of course, be using pruning. So that can be configured as much as you'd like. But, I mean, it's quite trivial to get like easily 100 gigs of SD card space on Android phones these days. So it's not a big deal.
Okay.
I noticed that the Chinese manufacturer called Pocophone, which there are lots of new low-cost phones with surprisingly high specs these days. So the Pocophone, it costs like $300 for an 8-core ARM64 CPU and choice of 64, 128, or 256 gig on-phone storage plus the SD card slot. So, phones are getting more powerful. I mean, I don't know, like probably the bigger bottleneck other than your network bandwidth is the CPU hit to validate all that history, right? So it's probably going to be backlogged on the CPU, even with an ARM64.
That phone is better than my laptop. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you need a laptop upgrade. The corners do look kind of...
This is my crap top, so I actually don't take my laptop from home. This is the crap top that I take with me to conferences to type transcripts.
That sounds like a prudent move for security reasons. I approve.
All right. Well, listen, look, I think that was really useful for everyone. Thank you both for coming on at short notice. Appreciated. You've both been on the past, so I'll just share out in the show notes everything you do. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so how was that? Was that helpful? Did you find out more about block reorgs? Is it a bit clearer to you? It's always great to have Adam and Bryan on the show. Adam has such a rich history in Bitcoin, and also Bryan just has a great way of explaining deeply technical items in a way that I can understand. So yeah, great to have them both on. Personally, with everything they explained to me, they just don't seem to make any sense at all. And really, they're kind of antithetical to Bitcoin's immutability. I thought it was great how Adam explained that essentially if you start allowing the reversing of transactions, it's no real different to PayPal. And that's what Bitcoin isn't about. Bitcoin is about having transactions that you can't reverse. You can't have chargebacks. And even though this was a hack of $40 million of Bitcoin and it would solve a huge pain point for Binance, it really just isn't healthy and it doesn't align with the core principles of Bitcoin. So look, I'm glad I know a lot more now. I'm glad I did this. I hope you did. If you've got any different views on this, it'll be great to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me. And also, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who supports the show. It's going to be a really busy week this week in New York. I've got so many interviews booked, so I'm not going to go through all the things you can do to support the show today. But if you do want to support what I do, head over to my website, whatbitcoindid.com, click on the support section. But yeah, I've got loads of interviews coming out. I've already booked 3 in the last few days. I've got about 6 more. I'm probably going to be releasing over a kind of more regular schedule over the next few days. You might get 1 a day over the next few days. But anyway, loads of cool interviews coming up. Can't wait to release them for you. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com.